Hello, students. This is Professor Gore. In this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about the actual American Revolution. And so, in the previous two lectures, we talked about the events leading to the American Revolution. And if you remember, specifically talked about that the American Revolution itself was pretty much a minority movement. If you kind of want to make it simple fractions, you had a little more than a third of the population, the original 13 colonies that supported the patriot cause or supported the American Revolution. You had around a third that were loyalists who remained loyal to the British Crown for various reasons. They may have feared anarchy in the 13 colonies. They may have had different government positions or had contracts with the British Crown that brought them wealth, or they just didn't want to rebel. And then you had a little less than a third or to a third group that was neutral. You had some people that lived out in the frontier that were isolated, didn't get news, that didn't even know a war was going on. That was usually not the case, but there were some that may have been so isolated out in kind of a backwoods area that didn't even know that was even taking place. So the war itself was actually led by less than the majority of the population. And so you can see right here from this kind of gives you some paintings of some of the leaders that fought. Of course, we've talked about George Washington being appointed as the head of the Continental Army. Horatio Gates was one of his commanders, ended up being sent to the South to try to stop General Lord Cornwallis. Ben Franklin, very famous American, member of the Continental Congress, and ends up becoming ambassador to France along with John Adams for a brief time. And he's the one that's going to get France to join on the side of the Americans. Nathan Hale, and of course Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. John Adams played an important role during the war, having been ambassador to France and later ambassador to Holland. Spent the entire war abroad. You had Marquis de Lafayette, who was a French officer sent over to help the Americans and help train and provide discipline based on European armies to the American forces. You had Baron von Steuben, another famous German, really a Prussian officer, which was East Germany at that time, who kind of helped whip the American army into shape. Count Casimir Pulaski, and then John Paul Jones, famous American naval officer. For the British leaders, King George III is kind of obviously the head of the British Crown, but in some ways makes some policy for the war, but really it's some of the generals that command. You have General Johnny Burgoyne. He called him Gentlemanly Johnny. He ends up getting captured at the Battle of Saratoga, which is a turning point for the American Revolution. You had General William Howe, another British general for the war. General Charles Cornwallis, who ends up surrendering at Yorktown, the last battle against the British in the American Revolution. And of course, the most infamous traitor in American history, Benedict Arnold. All right, so basically the war begins in 1775 at Lexington and Concord. The Declaration of Independence is not issued until summer of 1776. And so when the war breaks out, you really have a major problem financially. The Patriots were led by experienced politicians who commanded public support. George Washington, even though he's not necessarily the best general, he really was one of the great leaders of American history and had tremendous leadership skills. And so one of the things that George Washington is going to do is he is going to kind of defer to the civil authorities like the Continental Congress, which is kind of interesting because he didn't take absolute power as a military general, which shows humility on his part. And so he is going to win support of the Continental Congress and state governments because he didn't try to gain absolute power. He also acted decisively. He helped stop a mutiny at Morristown, New Jersey. He also stopped a coup by officers at the end of the war at Newburgh, New York as well, that could have overthrown our government. And he put a stop to that by reading this kind of heartfelt letter. And also Washington was able to mobilize militias in crucial moments in the war that paid big dividends. So for 2 years, basically, the first 2 years of the war, particularly after 1775 and 1776 and 1777, the British pretty much whipped the Americans. The Americans in 1775 and then beginning of 1776 got the British to abandon Boston, but they go after the most important harbor in the colonies, which was New York. And George Washington is given the task of trying to defend it. and it goes terribly. He is defeated a couple times trying to fight the British. He also made a military blunder. The British landed on Long Island, and actually he landed on Long Island to try to fight them. You don't typically put yourself on an island where you have trouble escaping against a much more powerful force such as the British. But Britain is going to definitely have some advantages for the war. They're going to have about 11 million people compared to only about 2.5 million that were American colonists. And of that 2.5 million in the American colonies, 20% of those were actually enslaved Africans. Some are going to fight for the British. Some are going to fight for the Americans. You had about 10,000 that gained their independence with the British, and about 5,000 or so that gained their independence fighting for the Americans. So Britain also had access to immense wealth because of their trade across the Atlantic. And also they began having their Industrial Revolution. If you've ever taken world history, that begins in the 1700s. And its financial resources paid for the most powerful navy in the world, a standing army of 48,000 British, plus about 10,000 German Hessians, as we talked about in the last lecture, that they had purchased kind of as mercenaries. Also, Britain had an experienced officer corps and support of really quite a few thousand loyalists in the Americas, and they also had the loyalty of the most powerful Indian confederation at that time in the eastern half of the United States, the Iroquois Confederacy. Eventually, the Iroquois Confederacy is going to break up during the war as a couple of them break off, and a lot of them flee to Canada after the war. Their biggest leader, a guy named Joseph Brant, was staunchly loyal to the British, actually been educated in England, and so he fought on behalf of the British. But the Americans, on the other hand, were militarily weak, financially broke, didn't have much money, and a lot of the troops went throughout the war without getting pay. Some would serve for a few months and then go back home to try to harvest their crops. So you had troops kind of coming and going. Eventually, they kind of implemented more of a professional army where if you left, then you could be arrested, hung, or shot. And so this picture right here is actually of Benedict Arnold before he became a traitor. He's actually a talented military commander, and he actually helps win at the Battle of Saratoga, which I'll cover in just a minute. So if you look right here, kind of shows you a breakdown of the advantages for the British versus the Americans. So, it's about 2.5 to 3 million. Not really sure the exact total. They didn't exactly do U.S. censuses back then. Britain had the first part of the Industrial Revolution, the only place in the world that had that in the 1700s. So it wasn't until the 1790s that the United States got the first factory, thanks to Samuel Slater. They were the richest country in the world. Even though they were in debt, they still had tremendous potential. The only country that really could challenge them financially was Holland. Holland just didn't have the resources that the British had. The British had a well-paid and well-trained army, where the United States had volunteers, and a lot of them didn't have good equipment and were poorly paid. The British kind of have arrogant officers who kind of made some foolish decisions. The United States did have dedicated officers. Thankfully, we did have some foreign leaders like Marquis de Lafayette, like Baron von Steuben, who helped us out. The British didn't really know the topography as well, while the colonists that fought for the Patriot cause did. Britain had the largest and most powerful navy at the beginning of the war. We didn't have any. The British aren't quite as motivated to fight, while the Americans, that kind of wavered. At times, the Patriots are very loyal, and some were willing to fight to the death, and others, came and gone as they went to home to harvest their troops. So if you look right here, this map kind of shows you where a lot of the battles are going to take place. So if you look up here at the map, you notice in 1775 in the very top right, that's up in New England. That's where the first battles of the American Revolution were fought. So even though New England is kind of where the Revolution started, after 1775 and the British pulled out at Boston in 1776, there really isn't much fighting up in New England. Most of the fighting takes place in the middle colonies around New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland area, and even upstate New York. And then in the later part of the war, it moves down to the south, and that's actually where the Americans are victorious at the Battle of Yorktown. So what's interesting is that the United States tries to invade Quebec in 1775, led by this guy, Benedict Arnold, with his dashing looks. Okay? But what you end up having is that fails because of the smallpox outbreak, if you remember from the last lecture. They were able to capture Fort Ticonderoga, which is significant because that fort being captured did provide the first cannon artillery for George Washington, which allowed them to eventually get the British to get out of Boston. So the George Washington ends up losing a couple different battles. He loses at White Plains in 1776 and Brooklyn Heights, also the Battle of Long Island, and a couple others. And so 1776, he had probably one of his largest armies defending New York they ever had. After he loses the Battle of Long Island and Brooklyn Heights and so forth, his army dwindles down significantly. So let me kind of explain the strategies of what ends up happening for the war. The British kind of a poor strategy. Instead of going after armies, if they just would have gone after George Washington's men and defeated the Continental Army, they would have won the war. But instead, they go after strategic towns and cities. So they capture New York, they capture Philadelphia, they capture Charleston, they capture Savannah, they capture cities in Virginia. But if they just would have gone after armies, the war would have been over in 1776 without question. And so one of the things that you typically did at that time of warfare is you try to show the other side that you had superior military strength, that they can't win, and so you don't have to fight a whole bunch, and they will eventually agree to surrender or peace. Doesn't happen. Washington won the war really by living to fight another day, because his army remained intact even when he lost, and was able to live on even if it dwindled down to 5,000 or so. He was still able to continue. And so that really kind of helped really save the war. And even though George Washington wasn't the best military commander we ever had in American history by any means, he was a good leader, and he at least understood that. And that's what saved the American forces. His strategy was to basically draw the British Army away from the seacoast and extend their lines of supply and to sap their morale while keeping the Continental Army intact. Congress had promised Washington a regular army of 75,000 men. Yeah, right. But the Continental Army never reached a third of that number. Many farmers wanted to worry about feeding their families instead of fighting. Can't say I blame them. Most Continental Army recruits were propertyless farmers and laborers. So it's not like today, where our troops are well fed and they're not paid that great, but they are given good supplies and good materials, especially in our U.S. economy today. A soldier can go off and in warfare in Afghanistan or Iraq, and their family be taken care of fine. Back then, it was a little bit different. The male was considered the provider of the family solely. Yes, the wife knew how to farm with them, and so it put a tremendous strain, much more than it even does today. And it's pretty straining to have your husband or wife gone off to combat, but financially to provide for your family, because farming is a labor-intensive occupation for sure. Also, one of the things that the Continental Congress did promise is land after the war, since they couldn't pay them. And that land they're going to promise them is going to be in the Ohio River Valley. And so later in a lecture, we'll talk about the conflict that's going to emerge with Native Americans while a lot of those veterans get free land in present-day Ohio and western New York. Anyway, molding these men into soldiers took patience. Still, many panicked in the face of British artillery and bombardments or flank attacks, and hundreds deserted throughout the war. So 1776 is not a good year. There's a great book by Dave McCulloch that talks about that. And really, it's the Battle of Trenton on Christmas Day in 1776 and the Battle of Princeton right after the New Year that saves the American forces. So what happens is Washington, through spying, actually discovers that there is a German Hessian troops being held at Trenton. Not being held, but they're stationed there. And what they wanted to do was basically surprise them. They knew that the Germans culturally at that time drank pretty heavily, especially around holidays. And being Christmas, they drank pretty heavily on Christmas Eve. The United States crossed the Delaware River. Is that famous painting of George Washington crossing Delaware. It's pretty historically inaccurate. Nobody was standing up, and there certainly wasn't a horse on a boat, as you see in the back. And they wouldn't have had their flag waving such high in the air to alert them that they're coming. They snuck across the river to go to Trenton. Surprised the Hessians, caught many of them still hungover or drunk from the night before, and captured a lot of them. Also won at the Battle of Princeton, which kind of boosted morale. So when spring came in 1777, Washington had new recruits come. All right, so a couple names to remember. The Loyalists are also called Tories. Patriots were called Whigs or rebels. I covered the Whig term in a previous lecture. That's where we get the term rebels, patriots, Whigs. So reasons why some remain loyalists. Well, they feared anarchy. A lot of them, some of them gained freedom. In fact, slavery was tremendously weakened after the war. British military superiority. You don't want to fight against the biggest guy on the block. And thought Britain would preserve religious freedom. They worried that the Patriots would not establish religious freedom, which ends up happening anyway. So we talked about the Battle of Boston. Washington had about 28,000 men until he loses at the Battle of Long Island and Brooklyn Heights, and he dwindles down to about 3,000. And so William Howe had about 32,000. So you got 32,000 versus about 3,000, It's like showing up to a gang fight and your gang didn't show. So the Battle of Trenton, like I said, was Washington's probably his best advantage because he had the element of surprise. And then also the Battle of Princeton was a big victory. So there's that famous painting down here I talked about where Washington's crossed the Delaware. That's pretty historically inaccurate. Let's see here. So let's talk about the Battle of Saratoga. What had happened was there was a British army in the north, up near Quebec and Montreal, that decided to march down near the Hudson River to help kind of pin Washington, surround him from the north and the south. Washington broke off his force, sent Benedict Arnold and another commander north. Burgoyne is a terrible general, ends up allowing his men to get surrounded, and when the Americans end up kind of cutting off their food supply, their numbers and foods dwindle, and so they actually surrender. And at that point, that's when the French realized, whoa, well, if the Americans beat the mighty British army, maybe they can win this thing. And you got to realize the French had fought against the British in numerous wars, and it was like their arch nemesis. This is the Yankees and the Red Sox. This is Ohio State and Michigan. This is Duke and North Carolina, and the French hated the British. And so what the French did is really they weren't really caring about helping out the Americans. They really just want to backstab their arch nemesis. It's like the Yankees backstabbing the Red Sox. They love to stick it to them, and so they end up with an alliance with the new independent colonies, and that's going to forever change the course of the war. This is Washington cross the Delaware. I love this painting. We had it on the back of one of my fraternity shirts in college, but completely inaccurate. Nobody's going to be waving their flags, say, "Hey, Germans, here we're coming." And also that the horses on the boats was pretty interesting as well in the background. So this is the Hessians surrendering at the Battle of Trenton. You can see their uniforms on the right, how they look different than normal British regulars. And so we've already kind of covered strategies, but you can read through this if you like. Talked about the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. The Battle of Brandywine was in Delaware in late September. And the British end up winning this one. Of course, right here on the bottom right is some reenactors. I'm not sure what these guys do for a living, but so at the Battle of Saratoga, kind of covered this. You don't have to know a ton about it other than it's the turning point for the American Revolution. It leads to alliance with France. And so Burgoyne ends up surrendering about 6,000 British troops to Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold ends up getting wounded. He thought he was going to get promoted after this, and when he kind of gets past that promotion, and later he kind of ends up turning to the British. So you can see the route and so forth for where Burgoyne was coming down from the south in Saratoga. Also, there was another conflict where the Iroquois Confederation lived at Orscani as well. This is kind of a cool painting at the Battle of Saratoga. And this is actually a reenactment of it. And this is Burgoyne surrendering his sword to Horatio Gates. So what role did women play in the war? Women played an important role. Patriot women made more homespun clothes. You got to be able to clothe your men in combat. Really, probably the most important role the women played is taking care of the home while the men were gone, farming in the fields, running the stores, continuing to do the occupation that they had made a living previously. So that's good, and really can't understate the importance of that. That's tremendous. The price of goods rose, especially since Britain silver or gold and silver had been controlled by the British, and they had prevented some of that from being given to the colonies beforehand. Price of goods are going to rise, and that's not good. You also had people that served on both sides who looted farms. So you might be neutral or mind your own business, and one day one of the armies appears and they take all of your livestock to eat and slaughter, and take all your food for the winter. And so now you're starving. The war did divide many communities, and unfortunately, war brings out the worst in human nature. One thing is that the problem, the one thing you can summarize too for the war throughout the entire American Revolution is money. How in the world is the Continental Congress going to come up with money? The money that did come up usually came from private donations from the founding fathers. They didn't have a way to really gather much taxes. One of the ways they did try to make money was they would seize people that were loyalists in the areas they controlled, and then they would try to sell that property to help fund some of the taxes, which it's a violation of the Fifth Amendment, but the Fifth Amendment's not in place yet. Down here at the bottom right, these are pictures of smallpox inoculation. This is revolutionary at this time. Smallpox was, as I told you in a previous lecture, one of the biggest killers of world history. It was a new practice at this time. It's called inoculation. Now, it's a little bit different than immunization, but it's the same kind of concept. Immunization is you usually take a dead strand of the virus and inject it into somebody with a needle, and your immune system learns how to fight it. What inoculation is, it's a little bit further than that. Usually, because they didn't have a way to keep dead strands of the virus or bacteria, what they would do is they would take somebody who is about well from the thing but still had it, and they would cut open into one of their pox sores and then make a cut on the healthy person and put the pus and stuff into their bloodstream. So it would give them smallpox, but it would give them a much weaker strand, and so they would come down with smallpox. Some died from inoculation, but what it does, it teaches your body to fight against smallpox. And it was a really, really gutsy call for George Washington. But by doing it, he ended up saving his men's lives in a lot of the winters at Valley Forge. So it was a gamble, but one that paid off medically for Washington's forces. Continental Congress does print paper money, but the old expression, it wasn't worth the Continental, meant that their paper money wasn't worth much. All right, 1778. So the 1776, 1777, other than the Battle of Saratoga, not good for the Americans. They won at Trenton and Princeton and Saratoga, but the rest of the battles they fought and all the other areas were typically losses. So at Valley Forge is kind of the famous scene where Washington's forces are struggling through the winter. In fact, the British actually sent a sniper to try to take out Washington, and actually the sniper had him in his sights, but he saw him commanding his troops and was so impressed by his leadership ability. He was such a tall man for the day. He was 6'2", but that was really tall. He was enamored with him and ended up not shooting him. As you can argue, could change the course of American history. A lot of people got sick at Valley Forge in the winter. They're stuck there. A lot of them disease. You have lack of sanitary conditions. You also have soldiers in close confinement. That's a recipe for disaster. You had about 1,000 deserted, but after getting trained by Baron von Steuben, this German-Prussian guy, during that winter, they're able to be a much better fighting force in the spring of 1778. This kind of gives you a breakdown of what happened at Valley Forge. It stunk. It was miserable, and not one of the places you want to be in American history. And even George Washington's wife helped make clothes for the troops and care for the sick. I mean, it was bad with the capital B. So, and the Battle of Monmouth in 1778 was kind of interesting because what you end up having is, even though the United States doesn't win this one, it's 10,000 British versus about 11,000 Patriots. It's fought to a draw. So it's really one of the first battles that we stood toe-to-toe with the main British Army, and held her own. And so that shows you that Baron von Steuben's training worked. On the frontier, though, you had a lot of massacres. I took a class in grad school called the American Frontier, and usually what you would have, some of the greatest atrocities in world history took place. Well, not in world history, but in American history, took place on the American frontier. George Rogers Clark helped try to fight in the Ohio River Valley to seize that from the British. Joseph Brant led the Iroquois Confederation against the Americans in western New York. General John Sullivan ended up taking about 4,000 men and defeated the Iroquois at Newton, New York in 1779. But here's the interesting thing. And he decided he was going to go through and burn as many of their villages as he possibly could. And he burned about 40 Seneca and Cayuga villages. And really what this did is it broke the Iroquois Confederacy, because those tribes broke off of the Iroquois. And it's really tragic. What ends up happening is after the war, at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the Iroquois give up most of western New York and end up moving up to Canada. Not exactly a shining moment in American history. So because the United States did win on the frontier against Native Americans, where in the 7 Years' War or French Indian War, they kind of got whipped on the frontier, it really opens up the West for settlement after the war. So later, when we get to after the American Revolution, we'll talk about that. And so a lot of the Indians joined the British because they thought the British were going to protect them. And you'll notice after the American Revolution, that is going to be the case as well. They're going to fight on behalf of the British or the Spanish in the South against the Americans, and that's going to be an interesting conflict that will help contribute to the War of 1812. So let's look at how the United States actually wins. The United States doesn't win without the support of the French. So the United States signs two treaties with the French. One's called the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. The other one's called the Treaty of Alliance. Basically, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce dealing with trade. The Treaty of Alliance is dealing with basically that they're going to fight on behalf of the Americans, and they're not going to try to have a peace agreement with the British without the United States' consent, and vice versa. The United States is not going to have peace without the French consent. And as I mentioned earlier, it's all about revenge. So in the latter part of the war, here's the British strategy. They thought, well, okay, there's more loyalists in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Why don't we go down there? We'll win their support, and that'll break the Americans. It was dumb. They should have just fought against Washington right there in the Middle Colonies, defeated his army, captured it, and then called it a day. But instead, they go to the South, and so you have Howe still in the North, the Middle Colonies fighting George Washington. They send Lord Cornwallis to the South, and Cornwallis is initially pretty successful. So they go down, they capture Charleston in May 12, 1780. They also capture Savannah as well in 1779. And so Cornwallis begins to move north into South Carolina, North Carolina, up eventually into Virginia. So the Battle of Savannah is lost for the Americans, no good. And then Charleston Falls, which is portrayed in your first film assignment, The Patriot. And then in 1780, you had some interesting battles that took place. Well, one thing is that in 1780, Benedict Arnold becomes a traitor, and his plans get discovered, and he ends up escaping to the British. You end up having a couple of big battles that take place in the South. For instance, if you look at the movie The Patriot, the Battle of Kings Mountain is what's portrayed at the end of the movie, where the Americans prevail. That scene is historically inaccurate because it's got British regulars fighting against the Continental Army regulars. Actually, it was British Loyalist militia, not in uniform, versus Patriot militia, not in uniform. But it was the United States victory. And so who Mel Gibson's character is supposed to be is Francis Marion. They call him the Swamp Fox, not the Ghost or whatever it is they portrayed in the movie. And Daniel Morgan's another American commander that helps win at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina, and so forth that takes place at this time. And so the bad guy in the movie, who is Tavington in the movie The Patriot, is actually in real life supposed to be Sir Bannister Tarleton, and he does not get killed at the end like he does at the end of the movie. He survived back in England. He did commit some atrocities on the frontier, and that's historically accurate. Um, and so you got Thomas Sumter, the Carolina Gamecock, which is now the mascot of the University of South Carolina. And they have Patrick Ferguson, who was a famous American Tory leader or a loyalist leader, and so forth. So what ends up happening is Cornwallis wins some, he loses some in the South. Overall, he's being pretty successful, but he needs to get resupplied, and so he needs to make his way to the coast. So after he goes to Wilmington, ends up going north to Yorktown, arrogantly assumes that, hey, I'm going to get near the coast, the British Navy is going to reinforce me, give me resupplies, and then I'll go about my way and conquer Virginia. What ends up happening, though, is they found out about Cornwallis's plans, and the French force, which had landed at Rhode Island, about 5,000 under Rochambeau, ends up sneaking away from the middle colonies, as well as Washington's force, and the main British force is up there close to New York. They sneak down, and the Southern force, led by Nathaniel Greene, ends up surrounding Cornwallis and completely outnumbers him, and he's completely caught off guard. Now, the British still would have been successful had they had the British Navy there to board the ships and retreat and call it the day. But what ends up happening is the French ends up defeating the British Navy, which was rare in history because I always use the loss of the British Navy, defeated them and the Chesapeake Bay. And what ends up happening is the British are completely surrounded at the Battle of Yorktown, and Cornwallis reluctantly surrenders, as portrayed in the movie The Patriot. So that is the Southern Army that is now surrendered, but there's still the British Northern Army that's up in the middle colonies. But when the word gets back to Parliament that they humiliate the Battle of Yorktown, Parliament decides that they're just going to give up. It wasn't like the British actually just straight up lost the war. They just decided to quit fighting it. As a proud American, I'll give them that. But I'm just more thankful that we won the thing as opposed to them continuing to fight. So the Battle of Yorktown was the last battle against the British Army. There was conflict along the frontier all the way until 1783 or so against the Native Americans, similar to what happens at the end of the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War. You can see a more up-close picture of where Yorktown is. I haven't actually been to Yorktown. I've been near there when I was a kid. Here is Count de Rochambeau and Admiral de Grasse, who won at the Chesapeake Bay against the British Navy. And this is a painting of the Battle of Yorktown. And this is Cornwallis surrendering, or they call this the world turned upside down, because the most powerful military in the world, at least one of the most powerful, gets defeated by a ragtag bunch of colonists. So why the British end up losing the war? Well, for one thing is, as I mentioned earlier, they don't know how to fight it. They don't go after armies. They go after strategic locations and hoping just to divide American forces. If they just would have got with it, they'd have won the war in 1776. So big thing that ends up happening is what's considered diplomatic triumph. I think it's one of the greatest treaties in American history, is what's called the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Now, we should have signed it in 1782, but the holdup was Spain. Spain, during the American Revolution, joined forces with the French, which was one of their allies in the 7 Years' War. They don't join forces with the Americans, and that kind of complicates the peace treaty process. Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay helped negotiate it. And really, not only do we gain independence, which is tremendous, but the British give the United States all the land east of the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean, south of Canada, north of Florida. Really, on paper, the British should have just given us all the land east of the Appalachians, just gives independence, but they gave us all of that territory because they didn't want to fool with it. Why in the world would the British give us such a smoking deal in American history that we would get the entire eastern half of the United States, south of Canada, north of Florida, east of the Mississippi River? Well, a couple of reasons. One, they knew the United States was 25% of its economy before the war. They wanted to reestablish commerce. They wanted to make money off of us, and they do a good job of that throughout our history. And we'll find out throughout American history, a lot of British investment helped led to a lot of our infrastructure growth that we have in our country. And so we relied a lot on British investment, and they made a lot of money in the United States for various economic enterprises. The second thing is they knew that the Native Americans really controlled that territory, and they were somewhat probably hoping that the Native Americans would be at hassle for us. And we're going to find out in a later lecture that is exactly the case. And really, the greatest defeats in American history take place at the hands of Native Americans after the American Revolution. So basically, under this treaty, Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation, promised to withdraw their troops from American territory. They don't abide by that for a while, and we'll see under Washington's administration how that's going to that second one is going to be a problem. And they gave the Americans the right to fish off the coast of Newfoundland, which is one of the great fishing gold mines of world history. It's not too far from Nova Scotia, and it tremendous amount of cod that fish that's located there. So you can see right here from this map, all the light color on the right is all the land that they gave to the United States. Incredible deal. Of course, all these dots are frontier forts. The British claimed we were going to get out of, but they don't until Jay's Treaty, and that's going to be a problem. Now, one of the things, though, that will also come up again in Jay's Treaty is that the United States were supposed to pay back its debts that they had owed to British merchants before the war. Yeah, we don't do that. Also, that we're supposed to restore property that the colonial state legislatures had taken from the Loyalists during the war. That also didn't happen. So Britain doesn't abide by getting out of the frontier forts. We don't pay back our debts, and we don't return the property. So that's going to come up again. Just remember that. So it is a diplomatic triumph, though. We'll take it. And Spain is going to reclaim Florida, which we're later going to purchase it from them later in American history in 1819. We've covered why the British lost. That's what the Treaty of Paris gives us. Okay, so remember these issues with the frontier forts, the United States not paying back its debt. That will come up again later in American history. So what happened to all the Loyalists? Well, a lot of them fled to England. Some of them reestablished themselves in America and do okay. Some had their property confiscated and were never the same financially. Some were exiled, some went to Canada, some went to the Caribbean. It just depended. All right.